Howdy, my name's Iggy. I'm a solo indie developer and a person of interest in several ongoing criminal investigations. And this is my baby, the game I've been working on for several years, a tactical swashbuckler RPG set on Mars in the 1930s. So if you look back at some of the older videos on this channel, you can see that this is a project I've been working on off and on over the past several years as I've been teaching myself game dev and coding in my spare time. It's changed pretty dramatically over that time period as I've gotten a little bit better at this, and I've figured out better ways to implement the mechanics that I've been working on. In fact, a few years back I decided to scrap everything and start over from scratch, because a lot of the placeholder code had kind of stacked on top of each other. The whole project had become just impossible to work with. So when I started over, I decided to work out from traversal and combat and only re-implement other surrounding mechanics once I had both of those implemented and polished up to the point where I felt like they were inherently fun without necessarily having the context of other mechanics around them to support them. Also, looking back at those videos, I've noticed I've never actually talked about the narrative context of the game or the world that it's existing in. So folks who have already playtested the game have noticed some homages to Edgar Rice Burroughs' Princess of Mars or John Carter series. And that is sort of like a starting point for the world that this game exists in. But it's not really taking place in the same universe. It's going to be its own sort of alternate history. But the idea is to capture the scientific romance and pulp novel aesthetic and its sense of adventure, while sort of critiquing some of the more troubling elements that those stories tend to reproduce. So you as the player enter this world as a special holy warrior of the Martian natives who's been raised from birth to be the greatest swordsman who's ever lived. But you quickly find that this training has left you ill-equipped for a world of gunpowder and tanks. I definitely want to mix the sci-fi, fantasy, and pulp adventure elements together. I find the contrast between these elements pretty exciting, both from an aesthetic and a thematic standpoint. As for the gameplay, I suppose you could call it a Mountain Blade clone with climbing and a heavier emphasis on narrative. But like I said, all I've implemented so far is the traversal and melee combat, hoping to work out from there over the next several months. So one of the things I realized when I started making the game over again from scratch is that the melee combat system definitely needed some sort of auto-targeting or lock-on mechanic. And this is because of the way directional attacks are handled. So when you hold down the mouse button, you pull guard, and mouse movement is then used to select your guard angle. And this means that the camera basically has to be locked, and that keeps these inputs from being mixed up with camera control. But this had the unfortunate side effect of making the combat in the earlier builds very stiff and difficult to control. So my first attempt at fixing this problem was to just have the player character automatically target and then rotate to face whatever enemy is in front of the player when they pull guard. This was a huge improvement over the older implementation, but it did come with its own set of problems. Like you can see from this older build, the player can actually occlude the enemy character, and it can be kind of hard to tell when an attack is coming or where that attack is coming from. Not to mention it was just not built to work with multiple enemies in a single combat encounter. So I realized that I needed to do a camera lock-on system in addition to the basic soft lock-on system that I started out with. So that's what I've been working working on for this build that I'm talking about in this video. So the solution I ended up putting together combines the camera system I was already using, which was developed by C# Accent Tutorials, with Cinemachine, which allows you to use dynamic cameras in Unity. So as you can see, I've got a number of Cinemachine virtual cameras attached to my camera rig. And if you look at the lock-on virtual camera, you can see that all it has is the Cinemachine framing transposer, which takes a target group and then tries to frame all of the objects within it in the center of the screen. So if we look at that target group, we can see that already it has the character's head, chest, and hand inside it. So it's always going to keep the player within the frame when you're locked on. But if we do go ahead and lock on to an enemy, you can see that it dynamically adds the enemy's head, root, and hand to the target group. This means that the player and the enemy are both going to be dynamically framed by the lock-on camera, which means that you're always going to be able to see where the enemy is in relation to your character, but more importantly, where their weapon is in relation to your character's weapon. This makes combat encounters a lot easier and a lot smoother in ways that aren't necessarily obvious from looking at just the footage, but one thing that you can tell from the footage is that it does make combat encounters much more cinematic as it zooms in to frame hits and near misses, which is something that I'm very proud of. And while I was at it developing the new lock-on camera, I decided to make some other camera states as well. As you can see, there is a separate Cinemachine virtual camera for when your character is airborne. This is a pretty simple camera setup. All it does is zoom out a little bit and tilt down to look at your character as he falls down. This helps you land jumps and keep the player character in frame while you're airborne, and also gives a nice feeling of movement. So in addition to problems with targeting during melee combat, one of the major issues to come up in playtesting was with the equipment system, because the icons used in the equipment menu would be difficult to click on, especially while the character was moving. So the last camera state is specifically for the equipment menu to make sure that the icons are always framed properly within the screen, which should make them easier to use, especially while on the move. Both of these systems are direct responses to feedback from playtesting, so I'm really excited to get this latest build out there and see how it's affected people's experiences with the game. So I've realized that the way that damage is handled in the game is a little different than some might expect. So I thought the best way to explain it might be visually. See, each limb of a character has its own hitbox, and each time a weapon hits one of those hitboxes, it does damage to the character. So if a character is hit by a sword strike in, say, the head, neck, chest, and the right arm, that would do 4 times the damage output of the sword for that single strike. Now the way that armor works is that each piece of armor is applied to a number of these limb colliders. So if a sword hits a limb that's armored, only the stamina damage will go through and the armor will absorb all of the damage to the character's health. In this example, since only the head and neck are unarmored, only those 2 hits will actually damage the character's health, the rest being absorbed by the armor and only damaging the character's stamina. In the future, when equipment, items, and the inventory system are more fleshed out, I'd like strikes like this to actually damage the armor itself, so eventually the armor will break. And this should make trying to deplete a character's stamina less of a optimal strategy. So in practice, what this means is when you're faced with an armored opponent, it's wisest to use a Martian heavy sword like this spike sword, because they're designed to defeat armor and cause more stamina damage. And if you attempt to use something like this rapier against an armored opponent, you'll see that slashing against the armor does very little damage, and you can wail on someone all day without having much of an effect. However, a new addition in this current build is the ability to use stabs from weapons like the rapier to get through armor. So this would be the optimal way to handle an armored opponent if you do not have access to something like a spike sword. So I sincerely hope this wasn't as painful to watch and listen to as it was to make. Hopefully next time I'll be able to talk a little bit more about climbing and the new grappling hook that I just put together. And also hopefully next time I'll have access to a better mic, because this one definitely sucks. But thanks for watching, and if you do want to play test the game, just shoot me a DM and I'll send you a link.